In this final third part of our series, I will share some learning on participatory action research data, specifically with regards to the analysis as well as reporting of our data to ultimately elicit further action with regards to policy and the uptake of evidence. Overview of this presentation, start off by looking at rigor, specifically in the context of health policy and system research. I will share our approach to conduct a rapid analysis of our participatory action research data. We will have a look at some examples on how to visualize the data generated through participatory action research and close off by thoughts on how we can further report our evidence for uptake, action, and ultimately policy intervention. Starting off with rigor in health policy and system research. Overall, a study is considered as rigorous when we consider the reliability of data, as well as the processes applied, the validity, as well as generalizability. Our policy and system research is mostly based in a qualitative domain where we work with qualitative data. So when we look across paradigms, for example, moving from a positivist, post-positivist, etc., in a quantitative domain towards the health policy and system research focus in the qualitative domain or paradigms, we can argue that the transference of terms across paradigms is inappropriate. But at the same time, if we reject the concept of validity and reliability in our research, we reject the concept of rigor. Rejection of rigor undermines the acceptance of qualitative research overall as a systematic approach or process that can contribute to the advancement of knowledge. We therefore need to apply rigor in our qualitative approaches, but it does not come down to transference, but rather an adaptation of what is considered as rigor in this paradigm. So how does rigor apply in health policy and system research? First of all, considering validity. Validity has reference to the credibility of the finding, not only or not to those who read it or once it has been published, but to those studied. In other words, the stakeholders and participants that have been involved in the research process should regard the information generated and the data generated and the findings to be credible. Generalizability in this context refers to the translation and not the transplantation, in other words, not cut and paste, of findings to other settings and groups. So this does not imply that it will be a direct transplantation, but a translation with consideration of a difference in context, settings, etc. Reliability is the extent to which the same method will yield the same results. And then, of course, we have to consider our sampling processes. In this paradigm of research, we apply comprehensive and rigorous approaches in order to ensure that we capture a sufficient number of perspectives, experiences, etc., in order to generate meaningful renditions of the phenomena of interest. And that is done through, for example, purposive sampling, convenience sampling, as well as based on a theoretical assumption, based on what we already know, what information is already available. We can also apply specific sampling techniques like snowballing. And the important consideration here is that it is designed to capture a sufficient number of perspectives and experiences. So overall, health policy and system research requires critical and questioning approach. Questioning and checking during the inquiry at all stages. conceptualizing and reconceptualizing. And as you can see in the illustration of our vapor design, we have a cyclical approach where after every cycle we reflect and adapt where required based on the learning from our previous cycles. Also, interpretive judgment, again, considering specific context, considering specific settings when we look at interpretation of our data and evidence. We also need to consider very specifically the policy relevance. In health policy and system research, we work with real problems in the real world, and therefore the policy relevance and the implications for policy is a primary consideration. A further important component is embeddedness. In other words, we are working with and for our participants and our stakeholders. We do not do research on these participants and stakeholders. And lastly, the researcher reflexivity and positionality. At various times, continuously throughout the research process, we consider our own position as researchers and repeatedly reflect not only on the research process, findings, data, outcomes, but also the positionality of the researcher. Moving on to a rapid approach to data analysis. So in this approach, we conduct the data analysis in parallel with the data collection. We use, for example, summarized notes, capturing the responses, which may be verbal or non-verbal, from our respondents during the various activities relating to our program. So that could be interviews, it could be focus group discussions, it could be workshop settings, etc. We also use various sources for as data. So that could include our own notes, it could include minutes of meetings, it could include inputs and outputs to our specific workshops, and I will show a few more examples later in the presentation. So we then conduct a rapid descriptive thematic content analysis as a team immediately following each engagement. So it's important for us to reflect frequently and as soon as possible after our engagement or whatever form of data collection we are currently participating in, to capture not only the inputs and outputs, but also our own reflections. The thematic coding and analysis is conducted in order to identify commonalities as well as divergences between stakeholders. We also captured content using a combined inductive, deductive framework approach, on which I will elaborate shortly. And ultimately, we refine and finalize the thematic framework, reviewing discrepancies and resolving any differences between the view of the different researchers that have conducted the analysis. I have two examples on the slide. On the bottom left of a very simplified thematic framework, and on the right, a more detailed, complex framework from similar processes, depending on the input through the data collection. The data analysis can be divided into 5 steps, starting with, first of all, with immersion. And in this process, as the initial organization of the data is done according to predetermined categories that would be deductive, as well as to a preliminary emergent themes, and that is the inductive part. The qualitative, as a reminder, means that we are being subjective. In this paradigm, it is believed that there is no one singular truth out there, and therefore we consider the view of our stakeholders as well as the interpretation and involvement of the researchers themselves. So in the immersion, the different team members who are participating in the project will individually be conducting this process, including the next step of developing a coding framework, where the development of a thematic or coding framework is done, that as a result from the process in stage 1. And this is then, again, combining deductive and inductive approaches. We would usually then get together as a team of researchers and share our respective individual preliminary thematic or coding frameworks and apply to the data to code or index it. This is done again iteratively until no new themes are emerging. This is referred to as our thematic saturation. This is conducted collectively, sharing the inputs from the individual team members from their draft coding frameworks. We will then have a summary grid where the thematic summaries are prepared with grids of dominant and recurrent themes captured, prepared with related themes and subthemes as columns in our grid, and the groups or respondents as the rows. This allows data to be distilled, as well as identification of patterns within and between different narratives. And lastly, final step is interpretation, where the established associations between themes are used to construct descriptive and explanatory accounts of the phenomena of interest. So following these 5 steps in a sequence over a period of time, we are able to conclude with a final descriptive and explanatory account. Moving on to data visualization. In participatory action research, as shared by Nombuyiselo during the part 2 of our series, we use different techniques to generate data. So the data that we want to capture and visualize varies from our input data, for example, on the slide, where some of our research participants are busy with developing a Venn diagram or stakeholder mapping, as well as the output, for example, bottom left, a problem tree that has been populated. In the middle is an example of an action plan with specific detail with regards to the role players, timelines, expected outputs, etc. And of course, also photo voice or the visual data that we have referred to. So we have different types of data that we can share and visualize as part of our inputs as well as the outputs of our participatory process. And ultimately, we would like to report the evidence from participatory action research for the sake of sharing with different stakeholders, but also towards uptake in policy and change in terms of the health system services, planning, reporting, etc., as relevant and as identified and demonstrated by the stakeholders and individuals who have participated in the research. And that is done in various ways and through various platforms. Of course, we have academic reporting through peer-reviewed journals. We also utilize research briefs that we share with stakeholders from different backgrounds. We have a website to share information. We make use of social media platforms as well as opportunities to engage with stakeholders from different backgrounds and settings, and therefore ensuring that the information, the data, the evidence that is generated through a participatory action research is shared as widely as possible within and outside of the research setting to ensure uptake and ultimately towards an improvement in our health systems. Thank you very much on behalf of the Vapor Learning Platform. Thank you. More information can be found at our website, www.vapor.org.